Welcome to the Covered Bridges of New Hampshire podcast, where we discuss all things related to covered bridges in the Granite State. Here's your host, Kim Chandler.
Hello, Covered Bridge people, and welcome to the podcast. Every covered bridge in New Hampshire has a name. Many were named for the town in which they reside, some for the waterways they cross, and some more were named after a person. Today we're talking with the Sandwich Historical Society Director Jim Mykland about the Durgin family, their namesake covered bridge, and their role in the Underground Railroad. Here we go. In this episode, we'll learn about the Durgin family of Sandwich. James and Jane Durgin lived in a home and operated a mill near the site of the covered bridge that would later take their name. While many covered bridges in New Hampshire are named after nearby property owners, the Durgin story bears telling. Jim Mykland will share the Durgin story with us. Jim has been the director of the Sandwich Historical Society since 2019. He has been an active member and a volunteer with the Society for many years, starting as a member of the Junior Historical Society in the 1960s. Over the years, he has served as an officer and a trustee, including 6 years as president. Jim is a retired emergency service dispatcher and has served on the Sandwich Fire Department for more than 45 years. He is also the moderator for the town of Sandwich. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Thank you, Kim.
So let's talk about you for a minute. Can you tell us about your connection to the town of Sandwich?
Well, I lived in Sandwich most of my life. As the natives point out to me, I'm not quite a native, but I lived here full time since my family moved here in the mid-60s, and we had come up summers before that. And then we moved up here about 65, 66. And I went to school here at the elementary school for a couple of years and then to high school in Meredith. I love Sandwich. I like to travel, but I've never found a place that I like to come back to more than Sandwich. It's a beautiful little town with a lot of interesting people in it. And I'm not including myself in that bunch, but there's a lot of smart people and artists and people from all walks of life. So for a small town, it has an interesting population mix.
So you've been there since you were little, but you're still not a native. Do you have to be born there?
No. I mean, even amongst the natives, there are divisions in that some of the old hardcore natives, you had to physically be born in Sandwich to be a native. If you were born in the hospital in like Laconia or Wolfboro, that didn't quite count because that's like 24 miles away. So for their mindset to be a true native, you had to be physically born in the town of Sandwich. Being born in a hospital is kind of like cheating. And I was born actually on the South Shore of Long Island in New York and grew up on the North Shore as part of the baby boom generation after World War II. And then that got too built up, and that's one of the reasons my parents moved up here.
Great. Well, welcome to New Hampshire. After all this time.
Thank you.
The Durgin Bridge, which is a spectacular bridge, but by the way, it's one of my favorites. Not that I can pick favorites, but it is one of mine. It spans the Cold River in a part of Sandwich that was once home to a mill and a large population of Quakers. Can you talk a little bit about that area in Sandwich?
Yeah, Durgin Bridge is kind of on the border between North Sandwich and Whiteface areas, neighborhoods in town. You're right, it does cross the Cold River, which has not been to its positives a number of times. Uh, it the Cold River is a very steep, narrow drainage, and the water comes up very fast, and can go down fairly quickly, but it drains a very steep area. And within 4 or 5 miles, there are bridges that cross the Cold River. One up at what used to be Weeds Mills, what we call the Pothole now, Durgin Bridge, a mile or two below Durgin Bridge, what we call Taylor Bridge. And then after that, it goes into the Bear Camp River, which goes eventually into the Saco and into the Atlantic Ocean in Saco, Maine. Um, so it's a very scenic area. Durgin Bridge is not a tiny bridge by any means, but it's not one of the longer covered bridges in New Hampshire. I'd say it's pretty normal size for covered bridge.
Mhm.
You know more about it than I do because you've visited all of them, but it's nowhere near like it's like not even half the size of the Saco Bridge up in Conway.
Mhm.
Um, it's a little shorter than the Jackson Covered Bridge, but it's a nice sized bridge in a beautiful setting. It's very rural, very beautiful, and it's not near any main road. So, in order to see it, you got to want to get there. And when you get there, it almost comes up on you as a surprise. You come around the little corner, and there it is. It's
Mhm.
and it's a classic setting.
And I know when uh, Jacob Barry built the bridge, he reportedly said that you could fill it up with wood and it wouldn't collapse. He was very proud of that. That he had built a strong bridge.
Yeah, well, they hadn't had real great luck with covered bridges at the site prior to Jacob Berry coming down. Um, if you look underneath the bridge, you can see what was probably the original uh, place where they crossed the river.
Mhm.
And the problem with that is that on the south side of the bridge, it's pretty flat coming up to there. But to ford the river to get to the other side on the north bank of the river is a pretty, not like Mount Everest type hill, but it's a pretty significant hill coming up from the river.
Mhm.
You forded the river, you had to get across the river and then go up the hill. So fairly early on in 1820, the sign on the bridge actually says 1828. They built the first bridge there and did what was fairly common is they put a center pier on the bridge in the middle of the river with abutments on either end. Now, going back to what I said earlier, that river comes up very fast and very deep. And back in the 19th century, uh, rainy weather events in New England were referred to as freshets. And they probably were hurricanes or tropical storms or heavy nor'easters in the spring combined with melting snow. And the water would come up quick, and the debris coming down the river, trees and houses or whatever, would come up against the center pier of the bridge and take the bridge right up off the abutments and wash it away. And there were four covered bridges there, four different covered bridges there before the current bridge was built in 1869. And my theory is that when the last of the center pier bridges was washing away, the local people, including probably the Durgins, stood there and said, there's got to be a better way to do this so that we don't keep losing these bridges.
Right.
And that's when the town contracted with Jacob Berry up in North Conway, who had built the Saco River Bridge in Conway Village. And he said that the way to go is to get rid of the center pier and use what they call a paddleford truss. And Mr. Berry was entirely correct in his assessment of that, because the present bridge has been there since 1869 and hasn't washed away.
Yep.
I've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen the water come right up to the bottom of the bridge, which is pretty spectacular because you can hear the boulders in the river coming down, and the roads have flooded out, but they've never had the bridge wash since 1869.
That's good. He built a solid bridge.
I was just going to say, if you look at the Saco Bridge up in Conway, it's actually like two Durgin bridges put together. There are two paddleford trestles in there, and that does have a center pier, but obviously very sturdily built pier.
Mm-hmm. Today's podcast is a little different departure, and I wanted to talk a little less about the bridge itself and about the family that the bridge is named for, because a lot of covered bridges across the country, but more so in New Hampshire, are named after people. And there's a reason why the bridge took a name, and sometimes the reason is a significant one, and sometimes it isn't. But I found that the Durgin family left me wanting to know more, and so I thought it would be worth exploring James Durgin and his wife Jane. So we know that James Holmes Durgin was born in 1815 in Parsonfield, Maine, and at some point he and his family moved to Sandwich. Do we know when the Durgins moved to Sandwich?
They actually may have moved after the Varneys, after Jane Varney's family moved to Sandwich. It was right about the same time, in the 1850s. There's speculation that because James Durgin drove the stage around Carroll County between Wolfboro and Sandwich and West Ossipee and Farmington, he may have known the Varney family over in Wolfboro, where they lived. And the Varneys had been in Wolfboro for a long time. It's still a Wolfboro, Tuftonboro name that you come across. There are people, a number of people still named Varney that live in that area. And as a matter of fact, our police chief in Sandwich, his name is Sean Varney, but he comes from Tuftonboro, and somewhere back along the way, he might distantly have been related to Jane Varney. Mm-hmm. But the Varney family moved to Sandwich from Wolfboro in the late 1840s, 1850, and they set up shop near where the bridge and the mill were, not exactly, but in that area.
And so the Varneys, so Jane Varney, who married James, she's my fourth cousin, 7 times removed. So we're related, but not particularly close. And I
a lot of Varneys out there.
Yeah, I think we're all connected somehow. And I know that there was some speculation that Jane and James may have met on the stagecoach, and I guess for our 21st century listeners, should we talk a little bit about the importance of a stagecoach and what that meant in terms of transportation?
The railroads really didn't reach the Lakes region in central New Hampshire until well into the 1850s and 1860s. I think that the first railroad that made the area came to the Weirs from Concord. And early on, the railroad came to Alton Bay, and then later on, the line that came to the Weirs kept up the Winnipesaukee and Pemigewasset Valley to Meredith and Ashland and Plymouth. Uh, but that was later on. Before that, in order to get around, people traveled by stagecoach. And before that, even wagon and coaches. The Abbott Downing Company, which was located down in Concord, made thousands of stagecoaches. All of the stagecoaches that you see pictured in the West, the great majority of them came out of the Abbott Downing factory down in Concord. In fact, the people who might be listening to your podcast of a certain age may remember the Highway Hotel down in Concord, which was located kind of where Pizzeria Uno and the LL Bean outlet are, right there in that corner.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big hotel in its time. That's where the political parties, especially the Republican Party, would have their meetings and conventions and stuff. They had a huge ballroom. And on one of the walls of the ballroom was uh, not a fresco, but a large painting of stagecoaches that had been made at the Abbott Downing Company, loaded onto flat cars, and headed out west. There were hundreds of these things on the flat cars headed out west. So it was a big business, and that's how
Mm-hmm.
people got around before railroads, by using the stagecoaches. And uh, they had regular routes, and they carried the mail and newspapers, and that was incredibly important, especially to these small towns like Sandwich, that were isolated. The day that the coach came in carrying the newspapers was a big day. People would come down and they'd read the newspapers from Dover and Portsmouth, and that way. And that's how they got their news and their information. And then, like I said, the mail came, and the mail was a money maker for the stage, because they would have a contract with the U.S. Post Office to carry the mail. And passengers could be kind of hit and miss. You never knew how many passengers you were going to have.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had a mail contract, that was a steady thing. They would pay you every, I don't know, month, every year, however they did it, to carry the mail between, say, Dover, eventually to Sandwich, or Wolfboro to Sandwich. And later on, when the railroads came, the railroad reached West Ossipee, the railroad reached Meredith. Sandwich, the railroad never came to Sandwich, and small towns like Sandwich that were located further away from either like steamboats or railroads, they counted until the early 20th century on the stagecoach showing up every few days with the mail and the newspapers and passengers, because the roads were so incredibly bad that people didn't travel far until the Civil War. Probably most of the people in Sandwich had never been further than a dozen miles from where they lived. The Civil War changed all that, because the young men joined the military and they got to see all these places, around. But generally, the natives never traveled far.
there's a biography about Jane that is pretty in depth about her and her life. But when she was 17 in 1837, she and her family moved to Sandwich, and it sounds like she was a pretty outspoken, flashy type of woman, which was unique for that time. And she has a reputation of being a brave horsewoman who reportedly rode two horses at a time with a foot on each. And her obituary said that she was the best manager of the horse which her sex has produced in our town during the lifetime of the writer.
She loved horses, and people who, love horses, they can talk to them and they understand horses. Uh, she obviously made a great impression on people with her ability with horses, dealing with them and talking to them and riding them. You have to remember too that she probably rode side saddle, um, because it was unfeminine to ride uh, with the regular English saddle until later on. Um, so she did all this stuff riding sideways, and supposedly that was one of her little tricks that she could do with a horse, uh, is to put a foot on each horse and ride two at once.
Wow.
Kind of like the Buffalo Bill Wild West show with
Right.
Annie Oakley many years ago.
Right.
Um, but there's another story that around 1860, Merrill Greeley, who ran the Waterville Inn, thought it'd be a really great idea to have a road or a trail cut between Waterville Valley and Sandwich up in Whiteface Intervale. Um, and there was kind of a trail that came up from Waterville through Lost Pass to Flat Mountain Pond. But he wrote over to Sandwich to challenge the Sandwich people to build a road or a trail from Whiteface Intervale up to Flat Mountain Pond to meet their trails that came over from Waterville Valley. And if the Sandwich people would do that, he would host them on July 4th at a big party celebration with, free flowing ale and cider and food and let's roast an ox, whatever. Um, and the Sandwich people took him up on that. So on that July 4th of 1860, a large group of people started up from the Whiteface End in Sandwich to go to Waterville, or at least up to Flat Mountain Pond. And amongst that group was Jane Durgin riding a horse all the way. And just for the sheer hell of it, when they came to a mill that was about a mile up the road, she rode her horse up the flume, the outlet of the mill, up to the mill just to show people that she could do it.
Wow.
She was an excellent horsewoman.
That's amazing. And she was described too as a highly intelligent, dynamic, courageous, and independent minded person who refused to be boxed in by society's narrow definition of a woman's place in life or by the Quakers' rule of conduct. That's a very powerful statement for that time period, isn't it?
It is. And you don't have to look any further than her marriage to James Durgin. Mr. Durgin was not a Quaker. We don't quite know what religion he was. We believe he might have ended up being a Methodist. But when they got married in 1844, they were married by a Baptist, Free Will Baptist clergyman at a church uh, 2 miles or so from where the Durgin family lived, without uh, all of the paperwork that went along with getting married. In other words, her parents didn't sign off on her getting married. She and Mr. Durgin just met the Baptist preacher to agree to marry them, and they did. And reading about it, her attitude was kind of like, "We were married, deal with it."
Right.
So she's very, very independent-minded. She taught off and on at the little schoolhouse, which was just on the other side of the bridge from the Durgin mill. And she had a literary society, a reading group, I think you would call it today,
Mhm.
of neighborhood people, mostly women, I guess, where they would talk about books and literary topics. Um, and she was very involved in that and like the head chopper for that. Um, and in rural New England, groups like that were very important. In Sandwich, there were probably like, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe more of those scattered around town where the local people would meet, like I said, mostly women, and talk about books and literary subjects and what was going on in the world. And I'm sure there was a great deal of gossip that was involved too.
Was that the group called the Jesse Circle?
No, that was a separate thing.
Okay.
Um, in 1856, the Republican Party ran their first candidate for president. They had been formed between the last election and the election of 1856 by a group of disenfranchised Whigs,
Mhm.
WHIGS, a political party,
Mhm.
a group called the Know Nothing Party. I
Mhm.
always love that one.
I know.
Um, and other political sentiments. And in 1856, they ran their first presidential candidate, James Fremont, who was called the Pathfinder because he was a guy who uh, was out west for many years, finding roots out there and going around the countryside exploring. Um, and he was married to uh, Jessie Fremont, who was the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a senator from Missouri. And Jessie Fremont was a very independent minded woman, not unlike uh, Jane Durgin. And later on in history, she actually got in trouble during the Civil War for expressing her opinions so plainly. But in 1856, Jane Durgin uh, became part of a group called Jesse's, uh, what was it? Jesse's Friends,
Jesse
whatever it was.
Circle. Jesse Circle.
Circle. Thank you.
Yep.
Jesse's Circle, which were a group of women in Sandwich who met. And it was, I mean, women didn't have the vote, obviously, until the early 20th century.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that they weren't interested in politics and what was going on. And there was a lot going on. I mean, then uh, probably the main topic was slavery, but it was also the expansion into the West. And there was a lot of moving parts in 1856.
Mhm.
So Jesse's Circle were a group of ladies in Sandwich that got together to discuss what you would call, I guess, the political philosophy of the Fremonts and support Jesse Fremont, support John Fremont through his wife Jessie. And I've never run across another mention of a Jesse circle, so it might have just been in Sandwich, or but that's what it was, and she was very involved in that.
The family lived in the mill property that's near the covered bridge. The building no longer exists, correct?
Yeah, that's been gone a long time.
Okay. And was that property originally owned by Jane's family? Did the Varneys own that property initially and then sold it to James and Jane?
The Varneys owned property in that immediate area. I'm not sure if they owned the property where the mill was or not, but early on, James became involved in the mill and eventually took it over, I believe, from the Varneys. Yeah,
Okay.
and it became as many things do, as you move along and new people bought things, it became known as Durgin's Mill.
And also during that time, there's a lot of family legend that home adjacent to the covered bridge was the station for the Underground Railroad. Can you talk about the Underground Railroad and what Sandwich roles may have been in that?
Well, yes, the Sandwich was always a very Quakery town, very Quakerish town. The Quakers came to Sandwich early on. The way that property was settled as the towns got away from the coast is you had a group of people called proprietors who were basically what today we would call land speculators. And they got lots and whatever in the town, and then they turn around and sell them to other people. And one of the things they needed was a settlement agent. And the person that they hired as a settlement agent was Orlando Weed, who was a Quaker from down in the Dover area. And he actually came to Sandwich, or his family came to Sandwich and settled here. And there were a lot of Quakers. The height of population in Sandwich was 1830. And in 1830, the population was around 2,750 people, almost 2,800 people, which made it at that time the ninth largest town in the state. And out of the 2,750 people, 25% of the people lived in Sandwich were Quakers. They had large settlements in what we call Lower Corner, which is where the original settlements were in Sandwich, and Center Sandwich. They built a Quaker church between those two places that are about 3-4 miles apart. And then there were so many Quakers that a few years later they had to build a bigger Quaker church in the same place. And then there were so many Quakers, there was another Quaker settlement in North Sandwich, very close to where Durgin the Bridge is. So there were always a lot of Quakers in Sandwich, and the Quakers, of course, are noted for their belief in nonviolence and uh, uh, not becoming embroiled in uh, conflicts.
Hmm.
Um, and they were very, very strong about that. So when to go back to the Uber history, when they wrote the Constitution of the United States, they didn't ban slavery until 1810 or 1820. I can't remember which. Um, and then after that time, there were supposed to be no new slaves brought to America, and that kind of went under the water. That
Hmm.
went away. Um, so um, there was slavery big time in the southern part of the United States, and slaves would run away. And in the 1850s, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act or Fugitive Slave Law, which made it illegal to assist slaves in running away from the South. And there were a lot of people, abolitionists in the North, who believed that that was wrong, that that was a sin. And amongst them were a lot of the Quakers. So the the way the world works is that eventually they had what they call the Underground Railroad, where the slaves would escape, and there would be a series of safe houses along the route that they could hide out in on their way to Canada, which did not allow slavery. And there were various branches of the Underground Railroad, but it was a big deal in New England and in New Hampshire on the way to Canada. One of the places they came through was Sandwich, and there were a number of houses in Sandwich. I can't tell you exactly how many, but probably a half a dozen maybe more, that we have stories of people, of slaves being hidden there on their way to Canada. And one of those places was the Durgins up at the bridge.
Mhm.
But that was a federal law. So if you get caught hiding a slave or assisting their escape, not only would they take the slave back, but you stood a chance of going to prison for helping. So it was a very courageous thing for these
Mhm.
people to hide slaves in their houses.
Given the possibility that one could be arrested or charged with a federal crime, did that prevent records of the Underground Railroad from being preserved? Is that do a lot of what we know about this exist in oral tradition?
Yeah, I mean, there's no like 12-volume history of the Underground Railroad,
No.
uh, like there is the government records of the Civil War. Most of the things written about the Underground Railroad have come about long after the Civil War because people just didn't talk about it, even after the war, not because they weren't necessarily proud of what they did, but there was always a chance that somebody would come back after them. They never knew. So they always kept it kind of on the QT, and people had started writing books about the Underground Railroad, and then you had Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, who were all involved to some extent. And then in the last, I don't know, 40 years, there have been a lot of books written about the Underground Railroad, but there's not a lot of written records to go back on. It's mostly oral or verbal histories that they're working with.
Mhm. And how do we know that the Durgans were conductors on the Underground?
Well, again, the oral history is that um, one of the male relatives told one of the Durgan descendants, Ida, I think her name was, uh, about how he remembered seeing a black person up in the attic of the house, and was told in no uncertain terms not to tell anybody about it, never. That it was important, but it was a secret. And he didn't tell this woman about it until like 50 years after, or 40 years after the incident occurred. I guess he figured by that point it was safe, but yeah,
That's a
that's
long time to
how
keep a secret.
we know. Yeah, yeah, and I'm not saying he never told anyone, but that's the only record that we have that he told
Right.
someone.
Well, and do you think that James's job as a stagecoach driver would impact his decision to help with that process?
By being a stagecoach driver, he knew a lot of people, a
Mhm.
lot of people, and that may have assisted in being able to move the slaves or the people from one safe house to another. Generally, I believe from the things that I've written, they either moved on foot, which would have been difficult because New Hampshire, of course, is a very
Mhm.
Caucasian state, even today. And people would have noticed, a group of black people walking down the road. But they probably were more moved around in the back of wagons covered over, maybe at night, say. But I'm sure his role as a stagecoach driver, like I said, led him to know a lot of people, and it
Mhm.
probably assisted him in knowing where people were coming from. Now, during 1856 to 1859 or 60, the Durgans actually owned the hotel in Center Sandwich, the Sandwich House. Um, some of the relatives probably were still running the mill, but the Durgans were actually running the hotel in the village. So they may have had some of the slaves there. I'm not sure. I'm not saying they did, but that might again have assisted them in moving the people along.
In 1863, in addition to the Civil War, there were a lot of Civil War draft riots, especially in the Northeast, as a lot of communities were against, their men and boys being drafted into this war. In Sandwich, there was a rather significant event. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln put out another call for 300 or 500,000 more military personnel in a draft. And that was not necessarily a popular thing. In New York City, there were draft riots in July of 1863. And there's the incredible, to me, picture of soldiers with dirt and blood still on their uniforms from Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, having to come to New York City to quell the draft riots there. And the draft riots there were because the immigrant groups, the Irish and especially, felt that they were being uh, improperly targeted in the drafting process, and they were mad at the blacks and the Negroes, and it was very vicious. A number of black men were hung or killed by the crowds before these four guys that still had the dust of Gettysburg on them came and brought uh, relative calm back to the city. But it wasn't just the cities. The draft had gone all over, and each town was responsible to have so many people went into the military, and they had agents that went around to serve the draft papers to the various people. And the Quakers refused to go to war. It was just built into them. They were pacifists, non-aggressive. They didn't believe in the war, and they were vocal about it. And in July of 1863, a group of townspeople in Sandwich, and I'm sure there was a certain amount of rum and cider involved in this, went up and burned down the Quaker church that was between Lower Corner and Sandwich, burned it right to the ground. Um, and they didn't do anything to the one in North Sandwich. But the people in Sandwich weren't mad at the black people necessarily like the big cities were. They were mad at the Quakers because they refused to serve, and that's what they did.
And so that would explain why the Durgins fled. They moved to Worcester.
Yeah, I believe that was probably a big part of it. Jane's sister Hannah and her husband had moved to Worcester and were living there. So the Durgins, out of a sense of safety, I'm sure for them and their children, moved down to Worcester for a few years. But then they came back to Sandwich because the mill was there, and you know that was their livelihood.
So what do we know about the Durgins after the Civil War, after they came back to Sandwich?
Well, James died in 1873, so probably only 5 or 6 years after they came back to Sandwich. But they continued to run the mill. And after James died, Jane and probably one or two of her children, her sons, ran the mill. And eventually they sold it. Um, and she was still active in the literary society, in public affairs in Sandwich. And she as I mentioned before, she was always a very contrary-minded Quaker. Um, she obviously believed strongly in the Quaker belief, but when they didn't suit her, she would take it into her hands to go ahead and do what she thought needed to be done. Hence, getting married by the Baptist, Free Will Baptist minister.
Right.
Um, I don't believe that James Durgin ever became a hardcore Quaker. And both James and Jane Durgin are buried in the Grove Cemetery in Center Sandwich, which was the Methodist cemetery. So I don't know. During the years that they ran the hotel in town, they might have become more involved in the Methodist Church, which was uh, located quite close to the uh, hotel. After the crowd burned down the Quaker Church in the villa in Center Sandwich, a gentleman who lived in the village gave the Quakers another piece of property to build a new church. So there was a Quaker church in the village until 1893, when the Quakers, the Center Sandwich Quakers, had pretty well moved away or died out. There's a touching written picture of the last year of the Quakers in the village, of 3 or 4 Quakers huddled around a wood stove in the Quaker church. And in 1893, they threw their lot in with the Transpontine North Sandwich Quakers and sold that building to the Grange, which was then a new organization in Sandwich, which was kind of like a political action group for farmers originally, but became more of a fraternal and rural organization. Anyway, the Quakers were on the way out. The Grange was new and vital, and for I think $100, the Quakers sold the building to the Grange, and that remained the Grange Hall in Sandwich until the uh, 1990s, when the Historical Society bought it.
Oh, okay. I think about, so Jane died in 1895, and it was
Mm-hmm.
over 100 years ago, and still that bridge is referred to as the Durgin Bridge, and I'm sure that other families have lived in that area since then, and it's been other. I like to think at one point maybe it was called the Varney Bridge. That makes me happy from a personal point of view. But how is it that a name like that stays? Why is it still called the Durgin Bridge after all these years?
Well, I think it's human nature, and especially New England human nature, where um, people tended to be resistant to change sometimes. Um, I talked a while ago about Weeds Mills. The Weeds built their mills a couple miles from Durgin Bridge, or Durgin's Mills, upstream on Cold River, starting in in the 1790s. And they ran mills there until about 1860 or so. And today we call it the area the Pothole, because it's a town swimming area, but that's still referred to as Weeds Mills, even after 200 years. Um, People are resistant to change, and um, for many years, when the Durgins ran the mill, you have to remember their mill was a big thing, because grain their corn, their wheat, buckwheat, whatever, to get milled. And having a mill in town to do that was a huge advantage, especially if it was close to your house. So, it was Durgin's Mills, Durgin's Bridge, and it just stayed that way. There was nobody that came along afterward to pick up the mantle and wrest it from the Durgins, if you will. There's a couple. There was a covered bridge a couple of miles downstream from Durgin Bridge that was always called the Taylor Bridge because of the family that used to live around there. Um, that eventually fell into uh, desperate disrepair. And one night in the winter, a man was coming along in a sleigh and he missed it was kind of an oddly angled bridge, and he missed the entry to the bridge and went down into the cold river. And he was wearing a new union suit, a new red union suit. And he looked in the water around him, and all he saw was the red dye, and he thought it was blood. And he started screaming to the people in the house next door, help me, I'm dying, I'm bleeding out. And they came down and they fished him out, and they were pretty disgusted when they figured out that it was just the poor dye in his union suit that was
Oh,
washing out.
no.
So yeah, that was the Taylor Bridge. That was the other covered bridge that we know about that was in Sandwich. And we have a painting of that bridge on, of all things, a tree fungus, which was a fairly common thing to do back in the 19th century. Uh, uh, was to paint things. We have a couple of them in the Historical Society collection. One of them is a picture of the Taylor Bridge, and there's another of uh, a scene, a bucolic scene. But yeah, that was the Taylor Bridge.
Interesting.
So I think that bridges became known by either geographical place in Conway, the two bridges in the village are the Saco River Bridge and the Swift River Bridge, which actually cross two different rivers, obviously, but that's what they're still called. The bridge that was out in East Conway was the Smith Eastman Bridge, which was named after the people that lived in that area, and was the Smith Eastman Bridge until it was burned down by an arsonist
Mhm.
in the 1970s.
What final takeaways do you have about the Durgin family or about their namesake bridge?
Well, in many ways, the Durgin family was not a what you would look at as an outstanding family in Sandwich that would have gotten written up in the Carroll County history. However, they had incredibly interesting aspects to their lives, um, with the Underground Railroad, with the mill, with the bridge, that make them stand out a little bit in the history of the town. And the bridge, and you know 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times more about this than I do, having done your book. People have an almost visceral attachment. There's something about a covered bridge, which, let's face it, is basically just a barn that was dragged across a river that you used to go from one side to the other. But people have always had an almost physical reaction to a covered bridge. Um,
Mhm.
the old New England, the kissing bridges, where
Yep.
the sweethearts would stop in the bridge and steal a kiss from each other. And a covered bridge was a lot of work because when they used to roll the snow, when they used snow rollers before they plowed, they would shovel snow. They would have to shovel or drag snow onto the bridge in order to protect the runners on the sleighs.
Mhm.
So it was an extra amount of work, but people love their covered bridges, and um, people come from all over to see the Durgin Bridge.
Mhm.
The state has done a very good job of locating all the covered bridges.
Mhm.
And when bad things happen to bridges, it becomes a very visible thing. In the 1990s, an arsonist again burned down the bridge in Plymouth, the covered bridge in
Mhm.
Plymouth, and people in Plymouth and Rumney were very insistent to the point of digging in that they wanted a covered bridge back. And the state kept telling them, no, you can't do that.
Mhm.
And they said, yes, you can. And the state finally had to give in and do the engineering to build a new covered bridge that would hold loads for today that are, um, much more than anything that any bridge was ever designed for in the 19th century. The bridge in West Ossipee that was off its foundations for many years,
Mhm.
the Whittier Bridge that they
Mhm.
just put back on the foundations over the summer and early fall. Um, People always were advocating for that bridge. The Durgin Bridge regularly, well, a number of times in the past years, has gotten whacked by trucks trying to go through it, like a
Mm.
furniture truck, van that'll take out some of the cross pieces above. And the town always fixes the bridge like it should
Mhm.
be fixed. Um, and back in I want to say 1990, somewhere around 2000, the state came up with a program after one of the bridge arsons to offer towns to put a fire alarm system in the bridge. And Sandwich took them up on it. And just as a little interesting end note, the fire alarm system that protects the Durgin Bridge, that type of system was designed for use in nuclear power plants. Um,
Wow.
they're coated wires, and if the heat affects the coating, the wires touch and it sets the alarm off.
Mhm.
And that particular system was designed for use um, in the panel runs and gauge runs for uses in nuclear power plants. So you're looking at a covered bridge that was built with like probably one of the world's oldest technologies, and it's protected with one of the world's newest technologies.
I know. I know. Do you think Jacob Barry ever would have thought of that?
No, but I'm sure that he took great pride in his work.
Yeah, he did. He did for
As
sure.
you said, that he told people that they could fill it with firewood and it wouldn't fall down. He was right.
Yep, he was. He was. Well, I am grateful for you sharing the history of the Durgin family. I think that, part of learning about the state's covered bridges is not just their design or their maintenance or like you talked about, the communities that stand behind these bridges to keep them and also to rebuild them when they've lost one. Those are all key pieces. But this has been a nice sidebar to learn about the Durgin family and know where that name came from. So when people visit the Durgin Bridge, they can have a little background. So thank you.
Well, thank you
Thanks
for
for
having
talking to
me,
me.
Kim. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye now.
Covered Bridges of New Hampshire is created by me and recorded in Hancock, New Hampshire. The song Old New Hampshire was arranged and performed by Josh Black. The introduction is courtesy of Greg Kretschmar. This podcast is a companion to my book, Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. You can find out more about the book, the podcast, blog posts, upcoming events, and an interactive covered bridge map at coveredbridgesnh.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. Please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kim Chandler. Thanks for listening.